All right. Well, I still see a few people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get our introduction started. I want to thank everyone for joining us. This is a program sponsored by the Professional Development Committee of AIA Richmond. And we are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Charles Duff, who is celebrating the release of his book, The North Atlantic Cities, for the first time in the US. I'm going to let him obviously dive into the contents of the book, but I'll give his introduction. Mr. Duff is not only an author, but also a planner, teacher, and developer and historian with a career spanning over 35 years. In addition to his writings, he's spent time rebuilding and rehabilitating over 300 buildings in and around Baltimore. And some of his accolades are serving as the president of the Jubilee Baltimore, which is the city's premier community development nonprofit. He also served as the president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and is a graduate of Amherst College and Harvard. In addition to writing and all those other tasks of his business in Baltimore, he spends time lecturing around the country. And has also been a guest teacher at Johns Hopkins. So without much further ado, I will hand over the floor to Mr. Charles Duff. Again, thank you, Charles, for joining us and speaking to AIA Richmond. The floor is yours.
Taylor, thank you very much. Yes. The only thing better than being virtually with AIA Richmond would be being personally with AIA Richmond. What is prettier than Richmond in the springtime? I don't know, Baltimore is not bad today, but Richmond, your city is something special. Taylor told me yesterday that architects, back when he was in school, were supposed to wear black turtlenecks. I'm doing my bit here, Taylor, but take it to the next generation. So
sorry, Charles, I do want to say we are going to have a Q&A at the end. I forgot to mention. So we're going to welcome the participants to submit some questions through the Q&A tool for you after your presentation. So sorry, I did want to throw that out there.
That's okay. I hope I know the answers. Well, I'm not much to look at, so we should launch in. I have written a book. All kinds of people write books. It's not that unusual, but it's unusual for me. And it's called, well, you can see it. This is the cover of it. It's called The North Atlantic Cities. The cover is a painting by Johannes Vermeer that was done in Holland in about 1670 in the city of Delft. That should give you a clue that the story includes Holland in the 1670s. You may never have heard the phrase, the North Atlantic cities. I had never heard anybody use the phrase, the North Atlantic cities, before I thought of it myself. I think actually that I invented the phrase. I didn't invent the cities, but I think I did discover that the cities have important typicalities, that they are cities of a certain kind, and that not every city is a city of this kind, and that in fact, both the typicalities and the differences are very important to people who are in practice as architects, as planners, as city administrators, as developers, or as citizens. So I think that I would be satisfied if my achievement with this book was to introduce a new four-word phrase into the English language, the North Atlantic cities. And since you're getting professional development credits for listening to me, I hope there will be a quiz, and I hope that one of the questions will be, what's the right name for this kind of city? And if you answer the North Atlantic city or cities, either way, I hope you'll get full credit. So Delft 1670 is the front cover. The back cover is Park Avenue in New York. So not all of this story is small scale, cute, homey stuff in the remote past on the other side of a large ocean. This is a story that begins around 1600, but it's still going on. And it begins on the European side of the North Atlantic Ocean, but it rapidly crosses to the other side, and it's been going on for more than 400 years now on both sides, the North Atlantic cities. Here's a list of them. If you're wondering which are these cities, you will see that your city, Richmond, if you're from Richmond, is down in the middle of the bottom. This is in alphabetical order. Uh, this is a list that begins with Amsterdam and ends with Washington, and has many of the world's greatest cities packed somewhere in the middle. Uh, Boston and Philadelphia on our side, Edinburgh and London on their side, Dublin, all kinds of interesting cities are members of the North Atlantic urban family. And it has been an absolute delight to me to research this topic. I hope I wrote a good book, but I know that I walked 2, 3, maybe 4,000 miles through really interesting cities and talked to hundreds of really interesting people. And if I didn't make a good book out of it, well, shame on me, because there are wonderful, wonderful stories in how these cities came to be, the challenges they faced, how they overcame those challenges or failed to, where they are now, and what they're doing next. I should say that I was moved to write this, first of all, because I noticed that cities had something in common. But I eventually came to realize that what's really important about the study of these cities, and it's important to me in Baltimore, and it's important to you in Richmond, because this is how our cities are shaped and how our cities work. What's really important is that what I've learned and what I hope I can explain will help us to get out of the urban crisis and will help us to help humanity deal with global climate change. Cities are the best friends of a low carbon footprint, and our cities are fine tools for humanity in dealing with this. Here is a map of the North Atlantic Ocean. That should be important to a story with a name like this. The cities that were on that list are found in 2 coastal strips on the 2 sides of the North Atlantic, in the Netherlands, the UK, the Republic of Ireland on the European side, and then on our side, the coastal strip from Richmond in the south to New York in the north, with a southern outlier in Savannah and a northern outlier in Boston. Both of those outliers pretty glorious. And then some western outliers along the valley of the Ohio River, cities like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and even St. Louis. How do you know if your city is a member of the North Atlantic urban family? There's a very simple test. Ask yourself, do the old neighborhoods in my city have row houses? It's a simple question. If you're English, you ask, do they have terraced houses? If you're a New Yorker, you ask, do they have brownstones? But you're from Richmond, I'm from Baltimore. Do the old neighborhoods in my city, here's the question, have row houses? If so, my city is a member of the North Atlantic urban family. Spoiler alert, I've already shown you that I think Richmond is a member of this family. But just in case you were wondering, here is some of the evidence for the contention that Richmond has row houses in its old neighborhoods. Just a very brief gallery of things that you really can't find in Houston and Minneapolis. These are the evidences that your very beautiful city is a member of this family of cities on the 2 coasts of the North Atlantic. And here is evidence from your city that we're not just dealing with ancient history here. This is right here, right now. This is a way of building houses, a way of building streets, a way of building neighborhoods, and a way of building cities that is alive and well and even resurgent. These happen to be in your city of Richmond, and you're doing a much better job of contemporary row house architecture than those snobs out in Seattle who are just beginning to discover the row house and really have not got the hang of it yet. I think that your city, Richmond, has a real sister city within the North Atlantic family. And for all I know, this may be official. I could probably have looked that up, but I didn't. When I look at Richmond, say the skyline of Richmond, or at any other part of Richmond, I think of The Hague, the capital of the Netherlands. A skyline, a downtown similar in size to your downtown and not dissimilar in shape and in feel. But the similarities downtown are nothing compared to the similarities in the urban fabric of the two cities. You have the first great work of classicism in North America, the capital of your state in your capital city. The Hague has the first great work of classicism in Northern Europe, built in 1634, the Mauritshuis. Uh, and these are both marvelous works of architecture, barking up the same tree, bringing Roman classicism to societies that didn't yet have it. And get out into the neighborhoods and the streets, mile after mile of charming Richmond streets with row houses of often extreme elaboration, and wander around The Hague. Well, how about that? Here you are in the Spelingplein in The Hague. It doesn't look exactly like Richmond, but boy, it feels like it. How many odd things can you do with a row house? Richmond and The Hague should have an interesting little architectural dialogue on that. The Hague is one of my favorite places on earth. And it's not surprising that I like Richmond also. And if you look at my book, you'll see that I even say so. So if you're from Baltimore, as I am, or if you're from Richmond or Washington, you may have grown up thinking that every city had row houses in its old neighborhood. After all, if you live on the East Coast of the United States, every city does. But this isn't the case. If you go inland from the coastal strips on the two coasts of the North Atlantic, you find two very different ways of building cities. If you go inland in continental Europe, you'll find that the cities of continental Europe, and the most typical and the most beautiful of them is Paris, don't have row houses at all. Paris and Berlin and Vienna and Rome are beautiful, wonderful places, but they manage to be beautiful, wonderful places without row houses, if you can imagine that. They are cities of apartment houses. And here is a street in Paris. It is typical in that it has lots of traffic that's out to get you. It's also typical in that it is lined with beautiful palatial apartment houses. Paris may conceivably be the most beautiful city in the world. I won't argue with you if you happen to believe that. But it is a city of apartment houses. It doesn't have row houses, and it never did. Interestingly, Paris is extraordinarily dense. The city of Paris, although it doesn't have any skyscrapers, is almost as dense as Manhattan Island. I don't know how many New York apartments you've been in, but if you've been in New York apartments, you probably realize that most of them are small and cramped, and it's hard to entertain at home. The average apartment in Paris is only half as big as the average apartment on Manhattan Island. Parisian apartments are even more cramped. It's even more difficult to entertain at home. So what would people do in a situation like that? If your apartment is small and dark and you don't want to stay there and you can't entertain and you have the most beautiful streets in the world, you have glorious street life. And the cities of continental Europe are cities that play the game that Paris plays. None of them play it quite so well, in my humble opinion, but they all play the same game. The game is apartment buildings, high densities, and brilliant street life. How do I know that this is what Paris street life looks like? Because I asked Mr. Google, of course. I typed in Paris street life, and here's the first picture that came up. If you've ever been to Paris, you'll say, looks like Paris street life to me, except for that guy standing on his head, but you never know. Paris street life. This is a type of city. The cities of continental Europe are a type all to their own, and they're very, very different from the type of cities that we have here in the Middle Atlantic states, on the coast of North America, or in Holland or the UK. So there turns out to be more than one way to build a city, in what we call the Western tradition. Well, go west of the Alleghenies, and you'll find that there is yet another way of building cities. There is a classic American city. You find it on the other side of the Alleghenies or the Appalachians or the Appalachians. And seen from an airplane, these cities all display the same features. Which one is this? It's hard to tell unless you happen to know. It is Houston, Texas. But what you see in this picture of Houston is not dissimilar to what you see in most cities of continental North America. In the center is a business downtown full of skyscrapers. And in Houston, these skyscrapers are mighty. The tallest of the buildings in this picture are 80 stories tall. And when I'm standing on a street in downtown Houston, I think, boy, this could be Manhattan. This could be the Loop in Chicago. This is a big, mighty, high density affair. But look what happens as soon as you leave that skyscraper downtown. The density all just leaks out the bottom of the bag. And one friend of mine looked at this and said, wow, you got away from downtown, it looks like Arlington National Cemetery. Well, you get away from downtown in Houston, the density goes away. Paris has 200 housing units to the net acre. Houston has 5. Here is Houston Heights, which Houstonians bill as their great historic district. This is the Houston equivalent of the Fan. And so people told me I should go look at it. I hopped in my rental car, I drove out to Houston Heights, and this is what it looks like. 5 units to the acre. Well, I said, here's a third way of building cities. It's not like Paris. If you live in a place like this, a house like this, you can entertain at home. You can enjoy being at home. You can barbecue out back. But what kind of public life can you have? 5 units to an acre? You don't have enough people within walking distance of any one place to support walking distance commerce, restaurants, shops. So of course I asked Mr. Google. I typed in Houston street life. And here is the first picture that came up. There is Houston street life. This is not like Paris. It is what happens when your city is so sprawling that you have to get into a car or preferably a pickup and drive a couple of miles just to get a cheeseburger or a tube of toothpaste. So here we have 2 ways of building cities that are very, very different from the way that we're used to in your Richmond or my Baltimore. And when we think about the kind of city that we're used to, you know, if we play our cards right, we can have the best of both worlds. Here is a successful American North Atlantic row house neighborhood. This is Georgetown in Washington, D.C. Georgetown is a fully tuned up neighborhood. When a row house neighborhood is fully tuned up, people can live really quite remarkably nice lives. And if they have personal problems, that's their own problem. In a house like this, you can have more than one room. You can get good sunlight. It can be nice to be home. You can entertain at home. I've been entertained at home by people who live in Georgetown. Didn't seem to be difficult for them, and they were certainly very good at it. You can have a good home life just like people in Houston. What kind of public life could you have? What kind of street life can you have? Well, you can't have the intensity of street life that you get in Paris. You just don't have enough density for it. A row house neighborhood is maybe 25 units to the net acre. It can go up to 50, it can go down to 14. So it's a range of moderate density. What kind of street life do you have? Well, as usual, I asked Mr. Google, I typed in Georgetown street life, and this is what came up. This is a picture of Wisconsin Avenue. What you're seeing in this picture is 4 blocks away from the houses you saw in the last picture. And that's about right for North Atlantic cities and North Atlantic neighborhoods when they are tuned up and when they're working properly. You don't have commerce on every street, but you do have commerce within a 5-minute walk. And a good public life it can be too. London is like this, the Dutch cities are like this, increasingly Philadelphia is like this, increasingly Richmond and Baltimore are like this. We can do this. we can have the best of both worlds, houses that are fit to live in and good public life. And in case you were wondering, the North Atlantic pattern of building is dense enough to support good mass transit and a reduced carbon footprint. For evidence of this, you don't have to go very far. You go far if you want. You can go to the London Underground, my favorite subway system. But why not just go to Metro in Washington, which works just beautifully and works just beautifully within the context of what is fundamentally a row house city in its old neighborhoods. While we're on the subject of Washington, the North Atlantic tradition has added a lot beyond just having old row houses in its center. And the new developments that take advantage of Metro in Northern Virginia and to some extent in the Washington suburbs of Maryland are things that I am promoting as models to the world. They are really, I think, if any of you are from Northern Virginia, you have an awful lot to be proud of. The whole DC metropolitan region has an awful lot to be proud of in figuring out how to make it possible for people to live in different kinds of ways with a low and steadily reducing carbon footprint, even in the face of tremendous population growth and business acceleration. Quite extraordinary. And Washington, D.C. set the pattern. This is, I think, the ideal pattern, and it's what I recommend for how to make American suburbia car-free. Here is the grandmother of them all. This is an aerial view of Connecticut Avenue inside the District of Columbia. If you know Connecticut Avenue, you'll realize that these funny shaped things along the diagonal street are high-rise apartment buildings, and they have a lot of density. They have, in many parts of Connecticut Avenue, enough density to support walking distance retail, even a movie theater. But look at what is behind this double row of high-rise apartment buildings. Houses, most of them freestanding, some of them semi-detached, but most of them freestanding. American suburbia. And this is a win-win. The people in the apartment buildings provide enough density to support commerce and mass transit. And the people who live in the houses get to live with a low carbon footprint. They get a free ride off that density. And the people who live in the high rises get to look out over trees and beautiful lawns. This is a wonderful win-win. And Washington should promote this to the skies. This is, I think, a wonderful pattern for how we can try to reduce the carbon footprint of the huge amount of suburbia that we have stupidly built, most of it since the Second War. And throughout the North Atlantic world, people are at work right now in building really gracious, nice to live in suburbs that learn from the traditions that we piled up over the last 400 years. Here is conceivably my favorite. This is a new suburb, brand new suburb of Rotterdam. It's called Berkel-Westpolder, and you can get to it on the subway from downtown Rotterdam in 12 minutes. It's all brand new. And it is, I think, the place where I have seen kids having the best time with super soakers on a hot summer day. Just a marvelous suburban environment that happens to be built at enough density to make pedestrian, walking, biking, and subwaying work just fine without cars. Nor is it only the Dutch who are doing this. Here is a brand new suburb in Howard County, Maryland, just outside Baltimore, looking as much as it possibly can like the kinds of neighborhoods that we have in our old cities. This is new. This is suburbia acquiring enough density to make it possible to retrofit suburbia with transit, with biking, with things you can walk to. Quite remarkable, quite new, learning from the North Atlantic tradition. Now, a little bit of history. There have not always been row houses. Hard to imagine a world without row houses, and if you're like me, it might be unpleasant to imagine a world without row houses, but so it was. There were, however, proto-row houses. In medieval cities, although noblemen got to live in what were basically castles on compressed lots, The common people, that is almost everybody else, lived in tall, narrow houses like this. These houses were drawn in London at about 1600. The drawing isn't very good, but that's all right. The houses weren't very good either. These houses are 5 stories tall, and they're visibly proto-row houses. They're tall, they're narrow, they stand up above the street, but they are hopelessly flimsy. They're made out of wood and outdoor plaster. Think about the British climate. They are giant 5-story shacks. I will direct your attention to the middle where you'll see there's a middle of the picture. See, there's a little alley. Up at the 3rd floor level, there's a diagonal thing that looks like a log going across that alley. Know what that is? You're right, it's a log. And if you ask yourself, gee, why would somebody sling a log up to the 3rd floor and put it across the alley? The answer is pretty obviously to keep these houses from falling down. And it was always a clear and present danger in the old medieval cities that these rattle-trap wooden houses would fall down. Also, if you know anything about high-style architecture in and around London in 1600, you will realize that these are not high-style architecture. Common people in cities in 1600 in Northern Europe did not get high-style architecture. Only noblemen got high-style architecture in 1600. Well, somebody had to come along. If we were to have a happy life, somebody had to come along and figure out how common people in cities could have houses that were built of durable materials and were touched with the magic wand of high-style architecture. And the people who did that were the Dutch. The Dutch in the 1600s created the first major nation in history that was run by middle-class people in cities. Not surprisingly, they were the first people in history who figured out how to build durable, beautiful city houses for middle-class people. And here they are. These are not the houses of rich people. They're only 15 feet wide. If you're from Richmond, you know what a 15-foot row house is like, but they are beautiful. And are they durable? Well, I'll say they're still there. And look at the tops of them. These tops are treated architecturally. You are looking at the top of a skinny house that is treated as if it were a Baroque church in Rome, with those marvelous sinuous tritons coming down. My guess is that the builder of this house, like most people in Holland in the 1600s, went to sea fairly often and was comfortable with the iconography of the sea like tritons. The Dutch invented our way of building. The Dutch invented the brick row house, and they did it at exactly the moment in history when you would want them to. The Dutch had a golden age of painting, the age of Vermeer, and here's a painting by Vermeer, the girl with a pearl earring. Also the age of Rembrandt, one generation from about 1630 to about 1670. These painters revolutionized the world, and they did it by showing the beauty, the complexity, the depth of ordinary people. No one had ever tried to do that before. People in Italy and France were painting noblemen and popes, and they were making people look glorious. The great painters of the Golden Age in Holland looked at ordinary people in ordinary clothes and discovered their beauty, their fascinating depth, and represented it in the art of painting. That I would maintain is what the architects of the Golden Age in Holland did also. They took the lives of ordinary people and discovered their beauty and fascination and showed that if you treated them well and seriously, you could create beauty and harmony. Here is a canal street in Utrecht. It could be any one of 1,000 streets in any one of 100 Dutch cities and towns. I've walked probably 1,500 miles in Dutch towns. In my humble opinion, they are the best walking towns, best walking cities in the world. Just wonderful things. Now, this didn't just happen. The Dutch Revolution in painting didn't happen because a bunch of guys just decided they wanted to do something. It happened because the Dutch happened to have some really great painters who were able to take the feeling that was in the air of their society and turn it into great art. And luckily for us, they also had some great architects. Here is my pick for the greatest of them, a fellow named Jacob van Campen, contemporary of Rembrandt and Vermeer. What did he design? He designed the Mauritshuis. I showed it to you earlier. I can't get enough of it. It is one of my 3 or 4 favorite buildings on earth, rising like Venus from the calm water of a little canal in The Hague. He was a high style architect. He worked for princes. He designed great buildings. He did the Amsterdam City Hall, which was far too big for the city of Amsterdam and is now a royal palace. But he also designed the first 2 brick row houses ever built. These are they, on a canal in Amsterdam, built for 2 brothers named Coymans, 1622. Their architect was Jacob van Campen, the designer of the Mauritshuis. Our building tradition was not simply the work of unlettered craftsmen. Our building tradition was born under the tutelage of very great architects, and they did not disdain to build houses for the people. And I hope that you, as architects, do not disdain to build houses for the people. The people need you. And this really is the birth of our way of building. If I showed you this picture and said that it was London in 1750 or New York in 1800 or my Baltimore in 1805, you might say, okay, this is a canal in Amsterdam in 1672. The Dutch have already figured out how to build what we think of as 18th and 19th century architecture. The generation that the Dutch call the Golden Age has invented the brick row house and has founded the building tradition of Richmond, Virginia. How about London? London is the biggest row house city in the world. It has more row houses than any city in the world. And it just may be my pick for the greatest city in the world. I certainly can't get enough of it. It's flypaper for me. How did London get the row house? Well, they were looking at Holland, but they needed a good architect too, and they had one. Here he is. There's a fellow named Inigo Jones. And you Virginians should be interested in Inigo Jones because Inigo Jones was the first person in the English-speaking world who ever got interested in the architecture of Andrea Palladio. And he left notes which made it possible for British architects in the 18th century to become Palladian architects. And then Thomas Jefferson picked up on that and brought the particular Palladian blend of Roman classicism to Virginia and to the United States. But it starts with this fellow, with Inigo Jones, who becomes the surveyor to the king's works, the king's architect in 1617. Is he a great architect? I think so. Here is his first building in royal service, the banqueting house at Whitehall Palace. This is the first work of the Italian Renaissance to appear in England. And it must have looked like one of Corbus's villas from the 1920s when it descended into dark, smoky, medieval London in 1619. And if you know anything about English interiors in 1619, you know that they were oak paneled and small leaded windows and very dark. Here is the interior of Inigo Jones's banqueting house. He has let the light in. And is the first person in England ever to do that. 1619. Well, how does he fit into our building tradition? King Charles I made him head of building inspections for all of London. And he wrote the first London building code and he enforced it. And here is the first great work that came out of it. This is London's first residential square, Covent Garden. Did Jones design it? We don't know. We know that he designed the church, and that thing that looks like a Roman temple is in fact St. Paul's Church. We know that Inigo Jones designed that, and it's still there. But the houses, these are the first brick row houses, the first Dutch style row houses in English history, only 12 years behind the Kooijmans houses in Amsterdam. And we know that Inigo Jones at least had to approve the plans of them. How do we know? Because we know that the builder had to pay a permit fee, and the fee was an earl's annual income to build these houses in Covent Garden. So here we have the Dutch style coming to England under royal patronage through the work of one of the greatest architects in English history. And he doesn't just design buildings, he writes a building code. And that becomes very useful 30 years later when the whole center of London burns down. Here's the Great Fire of London, 1666. It destroys 14,000 houses, 101 churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, the City Hall. 80,000 people are made homeless, and all of London needs to be rebuilt. All of London is rebuilt in only 7 years, which is astonishing. And how did they know what to do? They knew what to do because they already had Jones's building code, and Jones's building code was straightforward enough for any average builder to follow. And here is the London that arose from the ashes between 1667 and 1674. If you think, gee, that looks like colonial America, I will say, gee, you know, you're right. Where'd we get the idea? This is how the Dutch way of building becomes the London way of building, and it happens in the 1660s and 70s. Through the 18th century, the London way of building diffuses through the British Isles. And every small town in England has streets that look like this, with houses that look like this, usually in brick. Every small town in Scotland has streets that look like this and houses that look like this, usually in stone. I lived in this street for a year, and when the sun was going down and shining on the granite facades of these houses, you couldn't look at them. It was like looking into a mirror. It was blinding. Scotland was not originally a row house country, but it became a row house country as part of a British urban renaissance. And not just England and Scotland, but Ireland. Ireland built some of the most beautiful towns, some of the most beautiful cities in the North Atlantic world. And I love this picture because it answers a question that many Americans answer me. They say, didn't people build row houses because they needed to live close to each other because there wasn't a lot of space? Look behind these houses. There is an uncultivated semi-mountain. There was space to burn in Ireland in the 18th century. Why did people build row houses? Because they wanted to, because it was the common practice of Britain and Ireland in those days, because they thought it was a good way to live. Personally, I think they were right. Luckily for us, luckily I think, row houses seem to have fitted pretty well into ships, and the British did a good job and the Dutch did a good job of bringing them across the ocean. Here is Society Hill in Philadelphia. Here is Beacon Hill in Boston. Here is Greenwich Village in New York. Here is Mount Vernon Place in Baltimore. And I trust I don't need to tell you where that is in Richmond. Linden Row, a really beautiful thing, worthy of anything in any American city. Well, from then on, the story gets quite dramatic. It turns out that in the 19th century, the North Atlantic cities more or less invent the modern world. They do this by inventing the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in the short run is a mess. In the long run, it makes us all rich and we live longer, and thank God for that. But in the short run, it is an unimaginable mess, and it creates all kinds of problems that our urban ancestors have to figure out how to deal with. They do, and it's one of the great stories of human history. And along the way, they invent a bunch of things that we take for granted. They invent, whoops, they invent public parks. It's the people of Liverpool who do that. 1840. They invent, wait a minute, downtowns. And when you think of a downtown, why not look at a picture like this? Because the greatest of all downtowns is Lower Manhattan. These places where everybody works and nobody lives. But it wasn't just New York that built a downtown. Richmond has a downtown. Baltimore has a downtown. Every British city has a downtown. And they all came to be at the same time, between about 1830 and about 1850. And that never happened in Paris, never happened in Vienna, never happened in Berlin, never happened in Rome. Why not? Well, that was one of the stories I had to figure out. And it turns out to be a fascinating story and something that you really kind of need to know if you're going to try to figure out how to deal with one of our cities. So we invented downtowns. Along the way, we invented skyscrapers, which made downtowns beautiful. Whoops. We adapted, I don't know why my laptop doesn't work very well. We adapted the Parisian apartment house and gave it our own particular flair. This is Park Avenue in New York, which is wallpapered with 14-story apartment houses. And the apartment houses doing as much as they can to look like Georgian brick row houses. Funny, beautiful, wonderful street. And then toward the end of the 19th century, we invented year-round suburbia. Suburbia could be informal, like Roland Park here in Baltimore. This is the neighborhood where I grew up. Or it could be formal, like, come on, picture, like your Windsor Farms. But it was suburbia. It was eventually quite automotive, and it became the dominant way of building on both sides of the Atlantic in the 20th century. The British did it at higher density than we did, and they have a lower carbon footprint in consequence. But in the first half of the 19th century, and first half of the 20th century, rich Americans prototyped suburbia, automotive suburbia, and in the second half of the 20th century, middle-class Americans made America an automotive suburban nation. With cars like this and neighborhoods like this. This is one of our great problems. Post-war suburbia is the vast majority of America's dwelling units. And somehow or another, we are going to have to accommodate post-war suburbia as we strive to be carbon better and, God willing, carbon neutral, and maybe even carbon better than neutral. Post-war suburbia is there. It is unlikely to go away. And that's our problem for the future. Our problem in the past was that post-war suburbia drained the middle classes out of all of our cities on both sides of the ocean, drained the people who could pay property taxes, drained the people who cared whether their kids did well in school, drained the people who had a wide range of marketable skills and could cope with changes in the economy, left our cities with fewer people and poorer people. Well, why am I showing a picture of Amsterdam? I'm showing a picture of Amsterdam because everybody thinks that Amsterdam is perfect and doesn't have any problems. But in fact, the urban crisis hit Amsterdam harder than it has hit even Detroit. We in Baltimore are sad because our city has lost 30% of its people since World War II. In the 30 years after World War II, Amsterdam lost 75% of its people. And when I first discovered Amsterdam, the center of the city had very, very little going on. All the big businesses and the banks had gone to the suburbs, families with children had gone. All that was left were students, whorehouses, and some art museums, and a bunch of old houses that nobody seemed to care very much about. So that if it can happen to Amsterdam, it can happen to anybody, and it did. The urban crisis happened to every city in the North Atlantic, and it happened hardest in the biggest and the richest of the North Atlantic cities, New York. This is the South Bronx in New York in 1974. an entire huge part of a city that was abandoned both by its tenants and by its landlords, buildings that were burnt out and abandoned, buildings that were demolished and turned into rubble-strewn lots. This is not London in the Blitz. This is not Germany after World War II. This is New York City in 1974. And by 1975, the next year, it all caught up with New York. New York was the center of the global economy, but it had lost too many of its tax-paying middle-class people. It couldn't cope, it couldn't pay its bills, it lived by borrowing. Eventually, its lenders wouldn't lend anymore, and the city came one day from municipal bankruptcy. The mayor of New York appealed to President Gerald Ford, who was a nice guy, and said, "Mr. President, we're New York, the country needs New York." And the president's reply, as immortalized by the New York Daily News, was negative. Ford the city dropped dead. Gerald Ford was a nice guy. But in the spring of 1975, he thought that the United States could do without New York City. And not only that, but if you read the literature that wise people were writing about American cities in the 1970s, most wise people thought that America could do without its cities. Most wise people thought that cities were obsolete. People didn't need to live so close together. Driving was fun and people liked it. People wanted to have lawns. They wanted to work in suburban office parks. You could do business by phone. If you needed to meet people in other cities, you just hopped on a plane. Cities were thought to be obsolete. And the bookies who were giving odds on the survival of American cities gave American cities very poor odds in the mid 1970s. Well, the bookies were wrong. If you bet on American cities in 1975, you may well have made some money. New York survived and flourished. It has 1 million people more than it did, and its murder rate is 10% of what it was. New York survived. Amsterdam survived. Amsterdam now faces the problems that Washington faces. There are too many people who want to live in it, too many people who want to work in it. It doesn't face the problems that it faced between 1945 and 1975. And although people in Amsterdam grouse about the tourists and the rents, I don't know anybody in Amsterdam who wants to go back to what Amsterdam was like 40 years ago. Amsterdam has come out of the urban crisis. And unless you convince me otherwise, I'm going to say that your city of Richmond, which was very deeply in the urban crisis, has come out of it, or is at least coming out of it. I am astonished to see what I see in Richmond and to read what I read of Richmond as your city rebounds, as your population grows by a net of 1% a year. This is quite extraordinary. New York's not doing that. Boston's not doing that. You're doing that. It's quite extraordinary. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so sorry that I'm not physically with you. I want to walk these places with you and hear what you have to say about it. So this is, whoops, oh well, this is an introduction to the story of the North Atlantic cities. I had a huge good time writing this book. I had to read some boring stuff, but you always have to read boring stuff. But I got to meet fascinating people, learn fascinating stories, walk fascinating places, and then sit down and try to share them with you. I hope it works. So Taylor, Kathy, AIA Richmond, thanks so much.
Charles, thank you so much for your time and that wonderful presentation. Very informative, and it's always refreshing to get a new perspective and insight into the town, the city where you live, and see it, you know, below the surface, what's behind everything. And so I want to again mention and remind everyone that Charles's book is available at his website. It flashed on the screen there briefly, but we also put the link in the chat at northatlanticcities.com. And Charles, I was curious if you have a few more minutes. You know, you ended the presentation there mentioning Richmond's current population growth. You know, we are kind of in a boom of you know, mostly younger populations coming to the city. I think I'm reminded of a statistic I heard that sometime in the past decade, the United States tipped over from having the majority of its population living in urban centers, and Richmond is as opposed to rural parts of the country, and Richmond certainly is part of that trend. I'm curious, what would you see in your research of North Atlantic cities and throughout history as a parallel or lessons that could be learned in our modern day trend of this resurgence of urban population, and you know, are there any lessons to be learned throughout history of these cities that Richmond and cities like it could look to, and as these population booms occur?
Sure. The key thing it's not so much history, it's really what's going on now. I think that there are two important things that we always have to keep in mind when we're thinking about cities right now and for the future. The first is that there are, in America and in all the civilized countries, about 5 times more college graduates than there were 50 years ago. 5 times more people who are used to the labors and pleasures of the mind. This is very, very different from any earlier population. So there are a lot of college educated people, and they tend to like things that cities are good at offering. But there's more. The other big thing is that only 1/3 of American households have children at home on any given day. 2/3 of American households are childless on any given day. This is mainly because we're living longer. We are kids for 20 years, we raise kids for 20 years, and we live to be 80. And for 40 years, we are childless adults on average. Put those two facts together, you have lots of educated childless adults. You say, gee, what do educated childless adults want? If you have a flip chart, you can put them all down. They want places to go, things to do. If they don't have friends, they want to make them. If they do have friends, they want to meet them. If they don't have mates, they want to mate. If they do have mates, they want to see somebody else. And cities have enough density to be good at that. That is what cities are good at. And suburbs are terrible at that. The suburbs have dullness, driving, and yard work on the weekends. Not what educated childless adults want. So that, I think, is what's powering the revival of those cities that are reviving. And the cities that are reviving the best are the cities that are tuning themselves up best for educated childless adults. It's probably no accident that everybody's favorite city, sort of too favorite for its own good, is San Francisco, which had its own way of becoming the capital of childless adults. But that's the model, and every successful city is following that, some more successfully than others. Very different from the kind of city that I grew up in, which was about bringing lots of people together to make steel and unload ships. That's probably still going on in the third world. It's not going on in the first world, and our cities are adapting to that. What our cities are now, sort of the export base of a city nowadays in America or in the North Atlantic world or in Western Europe, the export base, the base of the economy, is being a good place to live. It's livability. And when people decide that they want to live in your city, what I find is if you get interesting, educated, well-trained minds together, particularly if you have a university or two to fertilize them with money, you can regrow your urban economy. And the successful cities are doing that because private life is not just about partying. Private life also results in the formation of new businesses, not to mention new political and social movements. So I think this is potentially a good time to be alive. It's a great time to be a city.
Yeah. Well, I think another common sentiment I'm seeing from a few folks are, aside from, architects always trying to design the best spaces they can, what, from your vantage point as someone who is not just an author, but also actually out there in the city building and playing a part, what are some things that you would recommend that the typical, your run-of-the-mill architect could be doing in their city to help ensure that some of these values, these good urbanistic values, are being instituted in beyond just their one project, their one site? What are some things that we
Well,
could be
first
doing?
of all, you sadden me. You say run-of-the-mill architects. I didn't think Richmond had any run-of-the-mill architects.
That's my self-classification. That's what I put myself in.
Now, what can architects do? Well, the first thing architects can do is the first thing any of us can do, uh, which is to live in a city. Our cities almost died because all of the people who were capable of saving them moved out. And the key to their resurgence is that people need to move back in. There are cities like Washington where that's already happened. I don't think Richmond's in that category yet. I know Baltimore's not in that category. The first thing we can do is to put our mouths where our money is, and to to live according to our principles. Uh, Everything else is downstream, but I will say that architects are exceptionally influential people uh, if they try to be. Uh, I don't know if you've ever talked to a stockbroker about the stock market or a doctor about medicine, but if you have, when they say something, you probably take it fairly seriously because that's what they do. Well, buildings and places are what you do. And if you try, I think you'll find that your friends might take you seriously. Maybe not all the time, maybe you need better friends, but at least every now and then. And the issues that come up for architects nowadays are not trivial issues. Sometimes in history, the issues have been trivial, they've just been decorative. The issues that face us now as architects are not trivial. They are issues about how we can survive as a species. And the thing I love about the North Atlantic building traditions is that if we learn from them, we can get the carbon footprint down without changing the daily lives of the American people too much. That the normal North Atlantic ways of building, which are really different from most American ways of building, and are quite different from our own suburbs. Suburbs of Richmond and Baltimore might as well be in Houston. Still, the North Atlantic way is not that different, and people will put up with it, and you can make them love it. In fact, I initially wrote this book and thought I just wanted to have a coffee table book full of Playboy centerfold pictures of row houses so that everybody would love row houses. But it turned out that the stories were interesting and I couldn't resist telling them. But still, the basic thing is this is a way that the American people will volunteer to live, that can help to make us a helpful nation, helping the world to do what the world needs to do. Obviously, I don't need to explain that we're not always a helpful nation when it comes to the fight against climate change. We Americans have a lot of learning and growing to do, and our cities can help us to do that.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. I know we're at the hour, and I want to thank you again, Charles, for engaging